A reel I posted about ADHD in the workplace went a little crazy 2 weeks ago, like 60,000 views on Instagram. And I want to start by admitting something in it that was wrong. I said that asking someone how they work best costs $0. Somebody in the comments pointed out that 15 minutes of a manager's time is not actually free. And they are right. It is not zero. It is negligible, which is a different word. And I should have used the accurate one. So I'm telling you that up front because the rest of this episode is an argument about money. And if I want you to trust my math, I have to be willing to correct it. Now, here's the question that actually got asked over and over in the comments. And it is the real question. If supporting an ADHD employee is nearly free and replacing one cost a fortune, then why don't companies just do it? That is not a rhetorical question, and it does not have a cynical answer. So I want you to stay until the end of this episode because the answer is a specific structural thing. It has a name, and once you see it, you'll understand every frustrating accommodation conversation you've ever had. So let's dive into it.
Yes. Yo, it's Alyece, say it right, no cap. ADHD CEO, yeah, we run this track. Systems that slap, brains built different. We make sales in our sleep, yeah, the hustle's efficient. This ain't fluff, nah, this is strategy raw for the ADHD. Minds breaking every law. Hit subscribe, don't miss a single show. We're running on dopamine, let's go. Let's go.
Let me put the real figures on the table first, because I do want them to be citable. I am a very tactical person. I don't have a gray area. I don't like metaphors. Tell me what to do so I can do it. And I try to keep my episodes that way. But Gallup put the cost of replacing one employee at 1/2 to 2 times their annual salary. Okay. SHRM lands kind of in the same range, like 50 to 200%, depending on the role. So a mid-level person making 60,000 costs somewhere between 30 and 100 and $20,000 to replace. And most of that is not like the recruiter, okay? It is the vacancy, the ramp up time before the new person is actually productive, the onboarding experience, the extra load on the team that stays, extra hours there maybe if they're hourly employees, and the institutional knowledge that walks out the door and does not come back, or any money you've invested in someone for development that you don't get back. Gallup also estimates that voluntary turnover costs American businesses about $1 trillion a year. You're probably already like, Alyece, what does this have to do with anything you talk about on the podcast? And here, I'm going to tell you, okay, it's one more part that nobody talks about. Team productivity drops around 11% after a turnover event. Not the departing person's productivity, the people who stay. And so the math is not close. Supporting an ADHD employee you have is dramatically cheaper than replacing them. Which brings us right back to the question, then why doesn't it happen? So obviously this is really going back to my previous episodes. I'll link them in the show notes for you. This is kind of like part 3 of the ADHD employee series. And just like I said, the comments I've gotten on social media from clips of those episodes, not only are ADHD employees really feeling seen and asking harder questions and advocating for themselves, which is incredible. That's absolutely what I want. But also, I've had some conversations on LinkedIn with people who have neurodivergent employees. And so while this is not my typical content, and the podcast typically would talk about things for business and productivity and all of that, I was an ADHD employee at one point. I mean, that's why I started my business. If you don't know my story, you can read my book, or you can go back to some older episodes. But If I was more supported, who knows where I would have been, right? And so obviously, ADHD people are 5 times more likely to start a business. We've talked about that, okay? That's why entrepreneurship is a hot topic, because so many ADHD people become entrepreneurs. But not everybody wants to do that. And so I do think these conversations are super important. And so there were 3 answers in the comments of this specific reel I'm talking about. And I want to take all 3 seriously, because 2 of them are wrong and 1 is only partly right. So one of the answers in my comment section was companies are evil and they want control. And somebody wrote that companies are not really interested in saving money. They're trying to implement, total control over their employees. That comment got a ton of likes. So a lot of you feel that way. And I understand where it comes from if you have worked somewhere that, ground you down, that explanation fits your experience. And I'm definitely not discrediting anyone's experience. But I'm going to tell you that, that I don't think that's true. I don't think it holds up. Control is expensive. Surveillance is expensive. Rehiring the same role 3 times in 2 years is expensive. And so if an organization really were optimizing for control or total control, it would still want to keep the people it already controls, because replacing them costs more. Malice does not explain the specific pattern we see, which is companies losing money they would clearly rather keep, in my opinion, clearly rather keep. And I was at a book festival this past weekend, peddling my books, and I had several conversations. Obviously, my banners were really well done, if I must say so myself, because they did get a lot of attention and start a lot of conversations. And one thing that I heard over and over and over again was people looking for a different job. I had at least 3 conversations with adults ranging probably from mid-20s to mid-50s that saw my banner, saw, AD on the banner, and immediately was like, I've got to talk to her. And I heard it over and over and over, just how unhappy they were in their job. They're looking for something new. They're searching. And so your experience is framed based on how you're treated at work, what your JP&R say, your performance reviews. But I don't think companies are out to not support us. What's that saying? People don't leave companies, they leave managers. So a lot of times it's often the manager, which leads me to the second comment that I saw in my comment section. Managers are the problem. It said, if you as a manager cannot do the role yourself, then you are the problem. And I believe this for a super long time as well. I get the frustration. It is really hard to sit back and be criticized and directed by somebody that has no idea what you're doing. And for us as neurodivergent people, it doesn't make sense. Like, how can you tell me what to do if you don't know how to do it? But I said this in episode 214, and I still believe it. The manager in that story was not a bad leader. She was an untrained one. And nobody ever taught her to ask how someone works best. Nobody gave her the language for difference between the wiring gap and the will gap. You cannot fire your way out of a training problem. And blaming individual managers lets the actual system off the hook. And so, yes, there are bad managers out there. I've had them. You've had them. But I think a lot of them just don't have the language or the knowledge. I don't think companies invest in developing their people the way they should anymore, probably because of the turnover rate. They don't want to put money into someone they don't know if they're going to stay. So this really leads me to they are just cheap, which is comment number 3. This is the one that is partly right, but it's imprecise. Companies aren't always cheap, okay? There probably are cheap companies out there, but they are looking at the wrong number. And that is this entire episode. All right, so here's the thing I want you to name, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The cost of losing an ADHD employee and the cure for losing them are recorded in 2 completely different places. One is owned by 2 completely different people on 2 completely different timelines. I call it kind of like the split ledger. I've been in QuickBooks for like way too long trying to get all of our nonprofit books and stuff ready, and I'm thinking about ledgers here, so we're going to go with that. But 4 mechanics. 1, the cost and the cure having different owners. So the turnover cost lands in HR and recruiting. Their budget, their line item, their problem, the accommodation, the 90-minute schedule shift, how do you work best conversation. That happens on a team owned by a frontline manager. So the person who could prevent the expense does not pay for it. And it was never in the room where it could have been prevented. Nobody in the building sees both numbers at once. There is no single human being whose job is to look at that trade. And I remember this so clearly when working in an office corporate setting, that it was very much like stay in your own lane. And the lanes wouldn't talk to each other because everybody lived in this fear of losing their job. If Susie knows way too much about what I do, she could just replace me. There's this like incredible fear. Which leads me to number 2. The timelines do not match. A manager is measured on this quarter. So let's say you have to manage this budget. We go through it quarterly. Accommodation pays off in retention, which shows up 12, 14, 16, 18 months later in someone else's report, attributed to something entirely different. So even a manager who does the right thing gets no credit for it. The win is like invisible, it is late, which leads me to number 3. There is no line item for prevented. You never get a budget for the resignation that did not happen. There is no meeting where someone says, great work, we retained 4 ADHD employees who would otherwise have quit. Here is your bonus. It's not measurable and it is not celebrated. And organizations do not fund things they cannot count. Meanwhile, turnover is extremely countable. So the expensive thing gets tracked in detail, and the cheap thing does not get tracked at all, which leads me to number 4. Accommodation gets routed through legal, not through performance. So this is kind of that mechanic that does the most damage day to day. And it is the answer to why your 90-minute schedule shift turned into a 3-week process with a form. The second the word accommodation is used, the request stops being a management question and becomes a compliance event. I see this so much, obviously, with people I talk to on social media and ADHD professionals that reach out after they listen to these podcasts, but also in IEP meetings and things for children. When we're talking about accommodations, it becomes a legal document. And compliance processes are not designed to help somebody work better. They're designed to limit organizational liability. That is genuinely what they are for. So the process is slow and formal and documented, and it feels awful to be on the receiving end of it. Not because anybody wants to punish you, but because you got routed into a system built for a different purpose. And that system is doing exactly what it's designed to do. I hope this is making sense, but that is the split ledger. Not villains, not stupidity, a structure where the money and the fix never meet. This is why having a consultant come in to your workplace is so important. Somebody that can find these gaps where the connections are being missed. Having someone come talk to you about the split ledger system. If you're an ADHD employee, this is so important for you to know as well, because somebody commented that they're at a job that is nowhere near supportive and they are just guessing what to do. So I want to talk to you directly if you are that ADHD employee, because most of this episode has been about organizations and you need something for your random Tuesday. 3 things, okay? Again, tactical. Make sure you download this episode, subscribe to the podcast, okay? 1, do not open with the word accommodation if you don't need to. I know that sounds like strange advice, and I would totally give different advice to parents of children with like an IEP, but if you are the employee, the word triggers the compliance path, the legal, the attorney. And once you're in that pathway, everything gets slower, it gets more formalized, emotions get weird. A lot of ADHD employees actually need a management decision, not a legal one. So something like, I do my best work before 11. Can we move our check-in? That's a scheduling conversation. It does not need a form. And it's something good managers would do regardless if you ask for it. Number 2, if you do need formal protection, then use the word deliberately. okay? Because that pathway is also where legal teeth come out. And there are situations where you want that. The point is to choose which door you walk through instead of getting routed by accident. Pick your battles. 3, frame it as output, not as needed. Not because your needs are illegitimate, but because your manager is stuck on a quarterly timeline and can only approve things they can justify. So, for example, saying something like, this change gets you better work by Thursday. That is something they could say yes to. I struggle with this is something they would refer upward. And I want to be honest with you about the fourth possibility. Sometimes the answer is that the organization just won't do it. And the ledger's never going to resolve in your favor. And the healthiest move is out. That is a real answer. It is not a failure on your part. Now I'm going to take a minute to speak to the manager. If you are on the other side of the desk, here's what that split ledger means for you. You're probably the only person in your organization who could see both sides of this trade, especially if you're listening to this episode. And you almost certainly have not been asked to look at it. So look at it. Take your team. Take Gallup's numbers, 1/2 to 2 times annual salary. Work it out. What one resignation on your team actually cost the company. And then compare it to 15 minutes on a Tuesday and a schedule shift you have the authority to prove right now. Then do the thing you can already do without asking anyone. Ask how people work best week 1, before anything is wrong. Respond to a small request quickly, without ceremony, without attorneys, because everyone on that team is watching what asking costs. And introduce the language before someone in crisis so that disclosure and failure never end up in the same meeting. None of that requires a policy change. None of it requires a handbook change. None of that requires HR. It requires a manager who has seen both columns of the ledger, which until about 4 minutes ago, you had not. If you haven't checked out my book, Flow First Thinking, okay, in this book, I have examples, okay, again, very tactical, for all walks of life. And so many times when you buy a self-help book, it gives you this advice and you're like, I don't know how to apply that to my life. That's not my life, or my situation's different. I give examples for each one of the letters in my acronym Flow for a stay-at-home mom, an employee, a manager, an entrepreneur. I tried to pull different walks of life to give examples of how to apply it, because self-help books do not work if you don't know how to apply them, or if they don't work for your brain. So here's what I want you to do. One thing, and it depends which side you're on. If you are the ADHD employee, pick the one change that would most improve your actual output. If you don't know what that change is, please buy my book. It will help you. Okay. Write it down. Just how you would ask for it as a work decision instead of as a personal need. Do not send it yet. Just write the sentence. If you're a manager, run the number. One resignation on your team, 1/2 to 2 times salary. Write that dollar figure down. That's it. Then I want you to come tell me. DM me on Instagram at socially.awesome. Tell me which side you're on and what you wrote down. I read my own messages, okay? And the manager numbers are the ones I want to see, because I want you to know how big the gap actually is out there in the wild. And if you're the person who needs to bring this conversation in your organization properly, that is the work I do as a consultant, as a speaker, not a sensitivity training. Okay, I'm definitely not a sensitivity trainer. The actual math and the actual behavior changes that produce in the biggest return. I'll have that link in the show notes where you can fill out a quick form about what you're looking for. We can have the conversation. But next week, I'm giving you the script, the actual words, what to say to your boss, sentence by sentence, when you've never said it out loud. And for the managers listening, I am giving you the words to say back, because the answer you give in the first 10 seconds decides whether anybody on your team ever tells you anything again. So you're going to want to make sure you're subscribed for episode 219. If you got any value out of this episode at all, please leave it a review. It is the absolute best compliment you can give. Make sure you check the show notes for all the resources. I also don't think I've said this on any of my episodes yet, but Flow First Thinking is available on Audible as well for my ADHD friends who don't like to read an actual book. So until next time, make it simple, make it social, and make it awesome. I'll see you next week.